say that a new NPI member last year, Jack Simon, he served on the programming committee and he hooked us up with Ingrid. So this is an example of how you can participate and serve, and bang, we get a great speaker. So wonderful. All right. Ingrid Cockhren specializes in co-creating equitable and inclusive environments within organizations, collective impacts, and grassroots movements. Utilizing her knowledge of stress, trauma, history, human development, and personality, Ms. Cochran has been able to translate research concerning diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, DEIB, trauma-informed and healing-centered practices into community, workplace, and organizational solutions that suit both traditional and virtual teams. Ingrid Cochran's academic journey is marked by a BS in psychology from Tennessee State University and an MED in Child Studies from Vanderbilt University's Peabody College. Mrs. Cochran specializes in PACE science, positive and adverse childhood experiences, collective trauma, historical trauma, intergenerational transmission, brain development, developmental psychology, and epigenetics. Her diverse career experience includes role in corporate sales, juvenile justice, family counseling, early childhood education, professional development and training, and community education. Currently, Ingrid is at Harvard, educated press author, and she serves as an adjunct professor specializing in lifespan developmental psychology, abnormal psychology, and minority mental health. She is the former CEO of PACE's Connection, an international social work network dedicated to raising awareness of trauma and resilience. We are lucky to have her today, and I'm just going to turn it over to you, Ingrid.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to go ahead and share screen, but I just give a little bit of housekeeping. I believe the chat is working, so you can feel free to, throw questions in the chat or make comments in the chat. I'll be sure to kind of check it out, and then of course, Tiffany and Melissa, if something comes up in the chat that you want to bring to my attention in the moment, it's fine to interrupt me. I'm the queen of too many slides. So we will be going and through and skipping, but you will get all of them. And as we go through, because this topic is somewhat controversial, I want to just always give a disclaimer when I'm talking about race that none of this is meant to offend. And I always welcome any comments that are the pushback. And I also welcome you to share anything. So I'll be asking reflection questions and things of that nature that you can put into the chat. And then, of course, I want to carve out a little bit of time towards the end for us to have any conversation. So, and at that time, I welcome anyone to share their screen, or I'm not share their screen, but to raise their hand and to turn their cameras on. And so I'm going to go ahead and share, and let's hope the technology gods are with me today. Can everyone see my screen? Good. So this work is actually from a body of work that I have created last year that really is focusing on what equity looks like in practice. And so a DEI, which is a bit of a buzzword, but also a little bit controversial, is the area that I've been working in for the past probably about 15 years, but I didn't call it DEI. I've been focusing specifically on historical trauma. So how human beings are changed by large scale events like COVID, slavery, genocide, war times, and how that change is then transferred through generations and the mechanisms that make that happen. And so in my work over the last about 15 years, which started with African American children in the juvenile justice system. I was with children even before I decided to get my degree. It was actually the reason why I decided to get my degree. I was working with children through the Department of Children's Services for the state of Tennessee. They were 12 to 18 years of age. They had committed either 3 felonies, rape, or murder. And my interactions with them and my understanding of them and their family lives and their communities made me very interested in understanding how we get here, where we have children who are committing such crimes. And what I found, what I quickly stumbled upon, especially when I was at Vanderbilt, researching at Peabody Research Institute, was historical trauma, which then led me to a better understanding of adverse childhood experiences. And then we have the new science focused on positive childhood experiences. And so that kind of gives a bit of a recap of how I got here. What we'll do today is we'll talk and define those terms and connect it to kind of the existing theories and big picture that goes along with the field of psychology. We'll talk a little bit about how poverty, racism, sexism, and other issues within our larger society connect to mental health issues. We'll analyze this through a social ecological frame. And so one of the things that one of the reasons why I bring history into my work is because of social ecology, that we have to look at the big picture of influences and the different spheres of influences on our mental health and our development as human beings. And one of those is history. And so, and then we'll kind of look at what that means for identity and identity development. And then we'll go over some healing strategies. And so let's start with this statement. Anti-pathology is for everyone, but I tend to focus specifically on African Americans, especially African American women, mainly because of intersectionality. So we have a lot of issues that are wrapped up in our racial identity, our gender identity. And so African American women and Indigenous women tend to be groups that are most impacted because of that intersectionality, the different layers of influence. And so as we look at this statement, what are the thoughts that you have? Do you agree? Do you disagree? This is a good reflection point to put things in the chat as well. African Americans face unique and disproportionate barriers to seeking and receiving mental health support, including including cultural stigma, mistrust, and lack of culturally competent providers. Do we agree? Do we disagree? One of the things to always consider is that when we're talking about systems, that we have to include ourselves. So the field of psychology and mental health is a system. And if we're saying that there's systemic issues, systemic barriers, institutional racism and things of that nature, then we would have to include our own field. And so I see that we have agreement. No disagrees. So one of the issues that I found when I got into my studies in psychology was that we were dealing mostly with symptoms. Even when we added, when we get to kind of modern day, when we are adding in a very clear focus on neuroscience, we still don't know, the chicken before the egg. We have no idea of how we got here when it comes to mental health issues, especially in this time when we're in a kind of a mental health epidemic. But if we even look at neuroscience, we are still looking at symptoms, that there are root causes. And so what are the root causes? Obviously, our history, our complicated history in this country specifically, in America specifically, has created historical and systemic issues. We also have bias. We have a deeply rooted history of stereotyping. We definitely, I'm sorry, I have 3 kids under 6, so you may hear them. And then of course, we collectively are lacking in the appropriate amount of cultural awareness. And this is due to our history, the origins of our country, and it's definitely due to the history of psychology itself, the history of our field. And so when we look at, root cause, I found a statement from the first APA president, and another point of reflection. As we look at this statement, G. Stanley Hall is saying very clearly, explicitly, that he believed that people of color were in stages of incomplete growth, and that it was the duty of Western psychology to essentially save adolescent races from the liabilities of freedom. And I'll let that simmer for a minute as well. This is the first president of the APA, and this is what he believed at the time. And it was not a strange belief. This was very common for those in the industry of psychology, which was mostly driven by white male ideology. And so, when we look at this statement, what are your thoughts, feelings on this statement? Feel free to use the chat to communicate that. And we'll use this as another point of reflection as we're getting started. I see sadness. Anger, arrogance, and Linda, I appreciate the not surprising. Yeah, we have a very clearly documented history in our country that we should always use in our work, so that we are not surprised. We are able to recognize patterns, things of that nature. And so this statement was, I included it because it very succinctly encapsulates the field of psychology and its origins. That the belief at the time was that people of color and also women were deficient, inherently deficient. And now, as we move forward today, we find that people of color and women have the poorest mental health outcomes according to research. And so, what does that mean? Does this mean that white men don't have mental health issues? Or they're less likely to have mental health issues? Or is it a reflection of this field being built upon certain ideology? And so this, the root cause of the origins of psychology, help no one. I want to be very clear that when we're talking about racism, bias, it is also harmful to white people and white communities. It's harmful to everyone, especially if we're looking at mental health outcomes. Recently, within the last 10 to 15 years or so, we're having an increase of deaths of despair in white men. And this is a reflection of how the field of psychology has not benefited them as well, because we have built a narrative that women, people of color, are suffering from mental health issues and need support, where we have built an industry that has turned a blind eye to the mental health needs of white people, especially white men. And so this viewpoint benefits no one. And it has allowed us to have kind of a blind spot for white men's mental health and how to ensure that they're having optimal mental health. And it has hopefully shined a light on how we have no North Star in our research and in our theories about mental health, because it has been corrupted, just like all the other social sciences, by scientific racism and scientific colonialism. And so let's look at some kind of, key terms. When I say scientific racism, I'm talking about our history where, in Europe, we had essentially academic elites codified within textbooks a racial hierarchy. They came up with the term race. They created a racial hierarchy. We can find this in our research articles and databases today. I can pull it up right now in JSTOR. And it will say that the belief was that essentially at the time they were talking about Chinese, but Asian, African, and indigenous people were considered savages or semi-savage. And this meant that they had no history, no civilization, to even to the extent of saying they had no souls. And so psychology is literally translated into the study of the soul. And so what does this mean for the field? And it just means that because of scientific racism, um, we have built up harmful ideology that is perpetuated through the work that we do because we are unable to even create theories that are meaningful because they're lacking in cultural competence. But also, we're also not able to translate or understand research as we receive it as well, because we're looking at that research through a biased lens. And so, what are the effects of this issue within our field? So, obviously, the consequences here are that we have skewed and inaccurate findings. We have underrepresentation within our research processes in general. So less people of color that are experiencing being research participants in a real way. Obviously, this leads to generalizations and a lack of understanding. And we have research that is lacking in the context of racism. And so our large, big picture studies around IQ, identity, personality, human development, we're lacking the context of racism, which left us to lean back on scientific racism, which would say these groups are having poor outcomes because they are inherently deficient. That's the belief, because that's the origin. This allows us to believe that the environments that people are being subjected to are not the root cause of their poor mental health outcomes, which is not the case. The World Health Organization recently publicized that we have to take into account environmental factors when we're looking at poor mental health outcomes, and that they are the larger drivers as opposed to genetics or actual physical changes in the brain. And we're getting more research as we understand trauma that the changes to the brain and the body are linked to adverse events, especially in childhood. And so this has helped to give us an understanding of which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Are those changes in the brain due to environment, or are they based on genetics? When we bring in epigenetic inheritance, where we're saying that the experiences of our ancestors are impacting our genetic makeup and the expression of our genes, this means that those epigenetic changes are impacting my cognitive ability, making it more likely for me to experience chronic disease and have poor mental health outcomes. So my grandmother's experiences may be at play when I get a diagnosis today as a 30-year-old woman. And so what does that mean for the field of psychology? It means that if we move to an anti-pathology approach and we look more at environments and we provide more education to our clients that are focused on the larger spheres of influence as opposed to the individual, this allows people to have a better understanding of how they came about their mental health processes, their cognitive processes, how it's tied to their family, to intergenerational processes as well. And it also helps to deal with internalized oppression and racism, where people believe that the issues that they're dealing with are because they have darker skin, as opposed to the environment and the systems they're being subjected to. And so challenges that need to be addressed in the field currently, diversifying the curriculum, addressing Eurocentric biases, the lack of representation of non-Western scholars, the incorporation of indigenous knowledge, and reforming research practices are kind of the big picture issues that need to be addressed within the field. We'll talk more about incorporating indigenous knowledge, but this is very important. This is a huge source of healing, because what we're essentially talking about here with scientific racism and scientific colonialism is that we have built the field of psychology around Eurocentric ideas, which means that colonialism, one of the main issues with colonialism is that it stripped the traditional practices, religions, languages, cultural practices of those who were colonized. This has been proven to be, you know, having your traditional practices, your traditional language, feeling really connected to your identity is a protective factor against poor mental health outcomes. The body of research on that is huge. So this means that as we kind of go back and reach back for those indigenous practices, we may be able to bring a layer of healing to those who have been colonized. And so when we're looking at mental health, we have to talk about history and culture. And this is where collective trauma comes in and why it plays such a huge role in this discussion. I've been doing this presentation, and also let me give a call for Melissa and Tiffany. Please give me a time check. I don't have while I'm sharing, I can't really see the time. So just let me know when we get closer to the end, like 15 minutes out. So when we're looking at collective trauma, I've been doing this work since about 2015, 2016, way before COVID. And so, but COVID has helped my work morbidly, so that I can have a better way to outline how collective trauma impacts us. When we have a large scale collectively traumatic event, it changes our entire society. And so collective trauma is generally the seed of an intergenerational transmission of trauma. It's the seed event. It's also the seed event of historical trauma. COVID is an example of a collectively traumatic experience that we will see the ripples of impact over the next 20 years. And then definitely that transfer of trauma through generations. This research is solidly living in the adverse childhood experiences study. What we understand of trauma right now, it really stems from the study that I think was conducted in the 90s. But it outlined that experiencing trauma before the age of 18 had a significant impact on our mental health and physical health into our adulthood if it was unresolved. This is the initial 10 categories here. Abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, neglect, physical and emotional. Household dysfunction, meaning that you have someone in the household, especially a parent, who has a mental illness, who has been incarcerated, who's experiencing domestic violence, substance abuse, or separation. It has divorce there, but many families don't get married, so the separation is also impactful. And so that was done, that initial study was conducted, and the findings were huge. Chronic stress-related diseases were greatly experienced by those who had admitted that they had experienced childhood trauma. That included heart disease, which is our number one killer in America, but also cancer, stroke, and a host of other just chronic stress-related diseases. It also highlighted the high correlation with poor mental health outcomes, to include, diagnoses that we had considered to be inherited. And so when we think about, not just anxiety or depression, but also bipolar personality disorders, all of these other significant, impactful disorders were at a higher incidence for people who experience childhood trauma. The rest of the research on trauma that came in after that study highlighted that those 10 were not the only ones that experiencing discrimination, experiencing racism, intergenerational and cultural trauma, adult responsibility as a child, it just really opened up our understanding of what is considered um, adverse in childhood and how that impacts one's health and mental health as they become an adult. Um, this really helped us to understand that there are other mechanisms at play when it comes to mental health. And so, looking at this visual that the principal investigators of that study outlined, um, we see the base as adverse childhood experiences, ultimately leading to early death. So, those who experience extreme rates of adversity were passing away on average 20 years earlier, which was, this is people passing away in their late 50s, early 60s. The mechanisms that we're going to talk about today are the arrows on the side. So the yellow arrow, epigenetic mechanisms, and the blue, intergenerational transmission, is how these individual events are then transferred through generations, leading to poor outcomes for their descendants. The main culprit here is when you experience adversity in childhood, then you experience high levels of stress during a vulnerable time period. So obviously, childhood is extremely vulnerable, especially in the womb. So prenatal stress. So this would be mom maybe having substances or getting into a car wreck or having an especially stressful event. We all know that stress hormones can pass through the placenta. And so even prenatal stressors are significant because of the susceptibility of that time period. Early childhood, 0 to 3 is extremely impactful. And then we have another sensitive time period in adolescence. This is because in these 3 times, the development of the nervous system and brain are experiencing pretty much an upheaval. In obviously in the early years where the brain is developing rapidly before 3 years of age, we're talking about structural issues that can happen, and that neural development is disrupted because of those stressors. And then when we come around to adolescence, this is where we have another burst of brain development that is really focused on emotional development and the ability to attach to others. And when we have stress and trauma in that time period, it can have a huge impact because of that sensitive brain growth that is really tied to our ability to maintain relationships. And so when we look at race within this dynamic, because race within itself is traumatizing, we're talking about the trauma of exclusion. Human beings are social animals, and being excluded from others is definitely a source of stress, especially in childhood. And so when we're looking at race, we have to acknowledge racial trauma as a driver of poor mental health outcomes within our society. America is an extremely race-focused society. And so we have people who are dealing with racial trauma. It is a race-based mental injury that comes with living in a racist society. So, and it has the same implications of any other type of trauma. So PTSD and all the physical symptoms of PTSD and trauma and stress go along with race-based traumatic stress. And this racial trauma can come in different stages. So we have direct stressors. So this is someone saying a racial slur or you experiencing microaggressions at work. I want to be very clear that racial trauma is just like any other identity-focused trauma. So when we think about LGBTQI individuals, they are also experiencing trauma based on identity. When we think about women who experience very specific issues within our society around gender, the same can be said. So direct stressors, vicarious stressors. I included this picture of George Floyd because vicarious stressors, his death and the visuals that were the video of his death that was widely spread is a perfect example of vicarious traumatic stress. All of those who witnessed that video experienced stress. And it happened to happen at a very critical time when we were already experiencing a pandemic. So stress levels were already high. And then when we have this widespread vicarious stressor, it led to civil unrest. And so when vicarious stress, this is probably the most impactful in that it impacts a large groups of people and it is more likely to be transferred through generations. So children living in their neighborhood, witnessing the experiences of those around them who look like them, that's a vicarious stressor. Community violence is a vicarious stressor. People living in areas where there's a high rate of homicide, suicide, these are vicarious stressors. And then we have transmitted stressors, which is the focus of what we'll be talking about today. This is where we have huge, large scale, collectively traumatic events that then turn into historical trauma. So examples of this would be chattel slavery, genocide of indigenous people, land theft from indigenous people, wars, so World War I, World War II. And these types of stressors are transmitted through generations as people adapt and adjust to these stressful environments. So the adaptations of enslaved people during chattel slavery in America, it impacted every aspect of their life, parenting, relationships, food, internalized oppression is then transferred through generations. And so the standout symptoms, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but it leads to a susceptibility for chronic stress-related diseases. It also leads to a susceptibility for mental health issues like depression, substances. And so when we are thinking about intergenerational transmission, this is when we have a collectively traumatic event that is the seed event that definitely impacts us as a large group. And I used the assassination of JFK here as an example. These events shatter our understanding of ourselves. They shatter our sense of safety. They do not happen within a vacuum. They happen within the wider social political context. And so, for example, if we have textbooks that say that Africans and indigenous people are, without souls and without civilization, then it makes it easier to justify land theft and slavery. And so they happen within the larger scope of our society. These events have an impact on us to the point where it changes policies. It impacts the national sentiment. And also it trickles down to even just our decisions that we make as individuals. Do we want to have more children? Do we want to go to school? Do we want to better ourselves? Do we want to stay in the house all the time? These are all the different ways that, a collectively traumatic event can impact us as individuals. It impacts our collective identity. If we think to COVID in 2020, we had people that were in the streets upset about racial injustice. We had people that were in the streets upset about haircuts. We had people that were in the streets upset about masks. And so all of these different happenings during this time pushed us to have or forge new identities. Who am I? Where do I land on this issue? How do I feel about other groups that do not agree with me? Collective traumas often end with us infighting, scapegoating. They tear away at our understanding and ability to trust each other. And so this is what these collectively traumatic experiences in the past have done. So again, slavery, land theft, genocide, wars. And this leads to existential crisis. this leads to a deep feeling of anxiety just about the human condition or the state of the world. With that angst, we can easily fall into a difficult psychological legacy as we go through a process of meaning making of those large scale events. What does it mean? How do I process this information, internalize it? What are the lessons I'm going to teach my children? And so intergenerational transmission of trauma was first documented in the field in 1966. And it was due to a research that was done on Holocaust survivors and their children. So what they found was that even their children had PTSD-like symptoms, even though they had not actually been in any way involved in the Holocaust. And so what does this mean? The research has been very clear that we get up to 4 generations out from a large scale or traumatic event and still have impact. And this is not just with parenting, it is also genetics, it is also maladaptive coping strategies and things of that nature. So when we look at the different mechanisms, here we have probably the most impactful is survival-based parenting. Just imagine during slavery how slave mothers kept their children safe. What would it look like? It would need to be aggressive. It would need to be hands-on because the stakes were high. And there would also be issues around attachment because of family separation. We're dealing with family separation now at the border. We're dealing with family separation in the past at due to boarding schools. And so these kind of things wear and tear on our attachment styles. And we know that attachment style is greatly correlated with mental health outcomes. We have social learning theory, which is that children are going to model their behavior even down to the micro mannerisms of the adults around them. And they're going to be more likely to model their behavior after people that they align with, meaning race and also gender. And so social learning theory is in play as adults dealing with large scale, collectively traumatic experiences engage in coping strategies. Those children are watching, they're more likely to adopt those behaviors. And if those coping strategies are maladaptive or health damaging, then those children will inherit those behaviors as well and model them. And so maladaptive coping strategies are very significant within this process as well, as people engage in different ways to cope. Coping is coping is coping. Some not so good, some better than others, right? Exercise and eating well, it's a good coping strategy. Emotional numbing, isolation, anger, these are not good coping strategies. Substance use, not good coping strategies. But whatever the coping strategies are being used by the adults, the children are going to pick it up through social learning. And then the last is genetics. And this is very important because this, again, ties to changes in neural development. It ties to the difference, the changes in the brain. And what we are finding is that people who experience extreme situations, especially of adversity, and abuse and trauma in their lifetime are having epigenetic changes that lead to poor cognitive development, lead to mental health disorders and chronic stress-related diseases. And so what does this mean for us, as people who are in the role of counselors, therapists? What does it mean for us? And so when we think about, what this means on the larger scale, is that we have to do our due diligence, outward facing, of educating our clients about historical trauma. Psychoeducation is needed so that, especially with children, so that they are not internalizing the environment, the belief, they're not internalizing the belief that because of my differences in society, I am inherently deficient. Because this is tied to poor mental health outcomes, obviously. Just by being born into the space where I'm less likely to be accepted or more likely to experience trauma or more likely to experience racial slurs or acts of discrimination or stereotyping, this leads to a higher likelihood of me having poor mental health. I need to be educated about that from a very young age. And what it also means for us internally is that we examine our own biases, that we are actively working to understand how we have internalized our environments and what that means for how we see our clients and the communities that we're working with. And so let's look at historical trauma. Intergenerational trauma has mechanisms you can have within a family, right? You could have a woman who is experiencing sexual assault in her lifetime. That may lead to her raising her daughters differently. And that's intergenerational transmission. But when you have historical trauma, this is when this large scale trauma is tied to identity, geography, a specific racial group, a specific ethnic group. And so these social groupings that we have in our society, when we have collectively traumatic experiences within those groups, it leads to historical trauma. We see this clearly in African American communities and Indigenous communities, Latino communities. Jack, who is Jack Simon, I met him through my historical trauma work, and we work together specifically for Jewish communities who have also historical trauma. So I want to be very clear, historical trauma is not about race at all. All of this discussions that we're having are about environments and events that have happened. And those events may be tied to race, but that doesn't mean that the mechanisms that we're talking about have anything to do with race.
Hey, Ingrid, we're at 12:45.
Okay, thank you. And so I want to look at what's possible. I'm going to skip ahead and outline historical trauma as the source of most of our issues within our society. The source around mental health, intergenerational, physical, emotional, sexual abuse. The root cause for educational outcomes and things of that nature as well. And so our disparities are rooted in historical trauma. These are a list of historically traumatic events that have happened within our society. I want to be very clear about community violence and its impact, police brutality, large-scale economic downturns. I think about all the different ways that my family has been impacted by the Great Depression. I have a bag of bags in my closet right now. And I have scarcity trauma where I haven't thrown away a bag because I want to keep it. These kind of things stick with us. And so there's implications here through generations that have changed our physical bodies, our brains, change the way that we parent, change the way that we see ourselves, change the way that we see others. We will also see natural disasters and pandemics here as well. And so I'm going to, here we have kind of groups that are most impacted and symptoms, which we are very well aware of what the symptoms look like. The symptoms are what we deal with all the time. So incarceration, poverty, mental health issues, PTSD. The most impactful symptom that I think is probably really the driver for a lot of our poor outcomes is relationship difficulties. So relationship difficulties are so impactful because they are the reason why, if we say that our resilience lies in our ability to relate and connect with others and that we have safe and stable relationships, then our inability to have relationships and maintain them are really focused on, how we're able to maintain and keep our relationships going. This relationship difficulties erodes our resilience and prevents us from healing from trauma. And so ultimately what we're saying is that institutional racism with historical trauma leads to what our understanding of social determinants of health are today. and mental health disparity is a social determinant of health. So I'm going to skip over our timeline and go to healing, and then I'm going to give us some time to discuss what it looks like for us to incorporate healing into our work. And so one of the issues that we had was around identity and intersectionality. And this is how all of these different issues play together to increase our vulnerability for poor mental health outcomes. So not just race, but also disability, sexual orientation, issues of class and gender. This is something that we often explore in the field of social cultural psychology. However, at the end of the day, intersectionality is a good way to conceptualize the layers of impact from our society. And so this means people of color, especially women of color and children of color, have a high level of vulnerability. And so when we look at healing, obviously trauma-informed practices are helpful, but also we have to have that social ecological model. We have to look at the big picture. We have to look at our values, our history, our belief systems. And this will give us a space for healing. So as you can see on the side where we have, this is an interactive model where we have both healing and trauma. So on the healing aspect, especially at the individual level, this is where psychologists really work in. You know, we honor the resilience and fortitude of people. We listen and validate and help people to process and integrate their personal traumatic experiences. We engage in family healing, and we help to facilitate love and connection. So when we're looking at the healing aspect across the board, ultimately what we're trying to get to is collective liberation, the understanding that we are all interconnected and that we have to live by truth and reconciliation. And so I've included some kind of best practices. Home visiting is probably, even though it's difficult to do, it is probably the most impactful. It helps you to increase empathy, be very clear about people's situations in the moment. And it helps them to feel more comfortable as you're not in a setting where they have to travel to, that can definitely be an issue of distrust and things of that nature. But I want to be clear that all of these are very important. Promoting DNA repair, using genograms. I remember when I was a case worker, that was one of the things I would often throw up and remember very quickly. It's like, oh, we can skip this. But it's very important when you're dealing with people with intergenerational and historical trauma to map out what was the experiences of your grandfather, of your grandmother, so they can very clearly connect to the things that they are dealing with presently. Let's see. And I have one more thing that I want to cover. When we're talking about trauma-informed practices, we often leave out the empowerment, voice, and choice, and the cultural, historical, and gender issues in our work. These tenets are especially important when we're engaging in trauma-informed work. And without it, it allows us to really kind of put everyone into the same box. Not everyone is from the same background, the same racial identity. And so we have to be very clear about how we are healing individuals that are dealing with these larger issues. And so I'm going to send you these. So that you can see what this looks like, how we empower, what the barriers and challenges are. And the key takeaways and the conclusion is that the field has to take accountability. We have to do the work of how we are going to, what equity looks like within the field of psychology is that we have psychoeducation about historical trauma. We inform our clients that the root cause of their stress and anxiety is systemic and has nothing to do with them as individuals, so that they can heal in the appropriate manner, so that they can avoid internalizing oppression and discrimination. So I'm going to stop there. And give us some room to process what we have talked about. And if there's any questions that may have come up, I just want to give a very clear open, you can come off mute, you can use the chat. Anything that you want to comment on or process when it comes to this particular presentation.
Hi, I'm Jill Flowers. Ingrid, thank you so much. This is fantastic. So I guess one thing that I'm, trying to figure out is like, I like in sometimes when, working with clients who are parents and they want to talk about, issues with their kids. And when there's intercultural like differences, sometimes I was on, I was a member of a board for Attachment Parenting International many years ago, and we had kind of a multicultural board, and the subject came up about like physical discipline or physical punishment.
Yeah.
And there was a discourse about it, because I guess the research says physical punishment doesn't work and can be harmful. But it was like, wait, you're stepping on our toes. This is how we raise our children. One of the women was saying there, she goes, and I'm not going to stop spanking my kids, because this is what we do. And so I made me hesitant, that was before I was a therapist, but as moving into a therapist, I am hesitant to pass my judgment that, but I do strongly believe that physical punishment and, and spanking your kids just makes kids angry. It doesn't, and responding out of fear. And so I'm wondering, like, am I pathologizing this person because, they have a different cultural background?
Yeah, this is a good question. So spanking is one of those issues that we definitely have to talk about. It's not so much tied to race as it is tied to experience. And so if spanking is a survival parenting tactic, then this means those who use it are more likely to be experiencing a feeling that they're not safe. And if I'm not safe, then my children aren't safe. And that means I need to be more physical with them so that they are getting the information very quickly and understanding it very quickly. I live in a dangerous neighborhood, I'm going to be more likely to spank. If I live in the Bible Belt, I'm going to be more likely to spank. If I have a historical traumatic experience around enslavement and genocide, I'm more likely to spank. And so this means I do not feel safe. And I don't feel safe because my ancestors didn't feel safe. And they taught me that in times when I have a lack of safety, that I need to be more hands-on with my child. My child needs to understand that they need to respond to my cues and my directives like that. And the way that I get that to happen is by being physical with them. And so I would say, at least what I've done in my experience, is that I give options. And so giving options like a discipline toolkit, there's many ways to discipline besides spanking. So that's helpful without pathologizing. Like these are the things that you can do. On the other end, providing that psychoeducation is important. Yes, you're tied to spanking and your family is tied to spanking. If you try to stop spanking, your family is also going to be like, well, that's why there's the problem with their behaviors because you're not spanking. Being able to provide psychoeducation and say the reason why you and your family believe this is because the experiences of your ancestors. They did not feel safe. And this is the reason why we have differences in our parenting styles. Parents who feel safe parent differently. Parents who don't feel safe parent differently. If I'm, in a store, and if you look at different groups and you see like Black children in Black families, those children are like kind of right next to their mom. They might even be wrapped around their leg, right? And then you see white and also Middle Eastern families. And those children are just running around and they're exploring, they're coming up and talking to you and they're touching things, right? These are generalizations, but this is something you can see in real time. That's because those groups, their children are right next to them. They have experienced discrimination and events in the past throughout their ancestry, where if their children were not right next to them, they were not safe. That something could happen, that racism or other issues made them feel like their children need to be right next to them. And this is an appropriate reaction in a racist society. However, there's a cost, which means that child is getting less brain development because they're not exploring and touching things and talking to people. They're also experiencing high levels of anxiety because of the physical interaction. So they're on edge all the time, which makes their behavior more unpredictable and erratic. And so that psychoeducation is probably the most impactful. Because even if the person doesn't change the behavior, they at least know the root cause, as opposed to thinking, "Oh, it's just because I'm Black, so or it's just because I'm Christian." That's why I spent like they need to be able to see the big picture.
Thank you. That was so helpful.
Okay. I'm flexible on time. I know some of you need to drop off, and some of you can stay on. So if you have more questions, I'm here to answer any questions.
I have a question. I mean, given all your research and work, I mean, are you seeing any improvement, like in terms of how the field is addressing these issues or practice techniques
Um,
or
so I am seeing kind of the beginnings of improvement. So what I'll say is that we're having more discussion about it. We've gotten to a point where we are very clear on the mental health disparities that we have. And I also have a lot of people who are very clear, like in my work with community education, I'm educating people in the fields that are doing the work. So they are telling me, I don't feel comfortable or I'm not getting as much success with my clients of color. And what can I do about that? So there is this understanding that the gap is there, that it needs to be addressed, and what are different ways that we can address it. So yes, but we're at the very beginnings. I will feel like we're doing more when we have closed this gap around mental health. And that requires us to acknowledge that it has nothing to do with culture or racial differences and everything to do with the environments that we've created presently and in the past. So I have one question. It says psychodynamic psychotherapies. And so I think that, Freud was right about some things, the unconscious, it's a lot there. And as we help people to bring those unconscious issues to the surface, it allows us to even have the conversations. This is the issue of race in a nutshell. We are so much of our work is to cover up the feelings that we have about race. That even when we have the conversations, people are in their body. They're red, they're flushed, they're angry, they're needing to have stress. This is because we're not able to address it. So yes, psychodynamic and psychotherapy is very important, and that we definitely need to explore that. And we need to do it both internally and externally. So the therapist needs to do their own internal work, as well as facilitating the work of their clients. And so this is kind of the source of, people don't believe they have a good fit with their client because of racial background, because of ethnic background and things of that nature. But that can be overcome through a very clear work around biases and also being very clearly client-led, client-centered, human-centered work. Any other questions?